The session title is about exploring tension points and possibilities in the relationships between research, policy and practice. The context for talking about this is really because the tension points in the relationships between research, policy and practice are well known, well understood, not least by education researchers. They get inflected in different kinds of ways. They have structural, temporal, spatial dimensions to them. And they create awkwardnesses, but not least because different communities of practice, policymakers, researchers, practitioners have completely different priorities often. That was abundantly clear during COVID when schools were struggling to keep kids fed and government kept on banging on in England about make sure you carry on the pace of teaching just as if everybody was in school. We've also got contrasting powers across those communities of practice to set the terms of the conversation, to go for consensus building across disparate points of view if they feel like it, or alternatively create opportunities for a deliberative dialogue on contested issues, or they may just say, do this. And that's as true of researchers dealing with practitioners as it can be of policymakers dealing with the research community. So there are unevenness in power relations that are running through this. The point of this session is to draw on some examples from each of the 4 nations where people have explored and tried out different forms of research partnerships and thought about their challenges and possibilities. You're going to get 4 very different presentations, and each one will explain their own context. They will talk for between 15 and 20 minutes each, and I'm going to rigorously wave at them when they near their end of time. I put down under 3 relevant for the research community longer term, because if we get back to questions at the end of this, that's in a way what I'd like us to do. So we've got some quite disparate presentations. What does this all mean for the research community longer term? And I'm flagging up as part of the context there, post-COVID, the context of the cost of living crisis, and not least policy environments shifting. So I'm going to welcome Una O'Connor-Bones to talk about education and deliberative democracy in Northern Ireland first. She is going to talk without slides, and she will introduce herself. This is the running order for the rest of the session, and once Una has finished, all the presentations are loaded, so we just click on to the next one. All right?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I was worried that you wouldn't be able to see me or I wouldn't be able to see you over the podium, but I think we're good. As Gemma has said, my name is Una O'Connor and I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Education at Ulster University in Coleraine, Northern Ireland. And I thought I would spare you slides this afternoon, but I really would like to talk to you about a piece of work that a colleague of mine, Dr. Jessica Bates, about a methodology and an innovation that we have developed entitled Community Conversations, and how it has been used in the process of deliberative democracy, education provision and divided societies. And the paper is based on the publication by Dr. Bates and myself, and it's framed around the question, how can community conversations be used to give communities a voice in policy decisions? And what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is to introduce the community conversation methodology and the innovative community conversation toolkit that we developed, and how it was used then as a tool for deliberative democracy through citizenship engagement in important policy decisions. I then outline how it has been used to support deliberative democracy in the context of implementing sustainable educational change in the divided society of Northern Ireland, particularly around area planning for schools. And it's important, I suppose, to state at the outset that the methodology of community conversations, it isn't new, but there's a somewhat porous understanding of it, with differing interpretations across organisations and across disciplines. And because of the variability in how the methodology is understood, it's important that there are some core qualitative touchstones, such as, for example, the involvement of stakeholders in the research, contextualised analysis of the data, and research reflexivity. However, for us as researchers, a notable gap in the broader literature on community conversations are empirical exemplars demonstrating how findings can be used to affect policy development. Significantly, it has been an underused methodology in education research, and more specifically, again, within the divided society of Northern Ireland, there is little or no evidence of how it has been applied in relation to the school system. So it's within this context that the research described in my presentation was undertaken. And I'm going to use an exemplar where divergent community views on school provision were shared, and how the authors synthesised the community conversation methodology within a socio-ecological lens to illustrate how this deliberative democratic approach is particularly suited to closing the gap between parents and communities and policy stakeholders, and thereby enabling change. In this respect, I guess the research outlined in the symposium paper demonstrates a step back from the traditional top-down approach to policy making to reflect on the different contributions that research can make when we are working in partnership with others and at a different scale. So by way of giving a sense of background context, just a little bit of information on Northern Ireland. Although Northern Ireland is considered to be a post-conflict society, it does nonetheless remain deeply divided, and the school system is possibly one of the most contested policy issues, with up to 95% of pupils attending schools that are segregated on the basis of religion. And the inherent duplication that ends up being created by this system and the accompanying challenges relative to this, for example, budgetary considerations, financial cutbacks, school transport, distribution of school places, are very well known, but the process of implementing solutions have moved at an extremely slow pace. However, in recent years, increasingly, the policy imperative has centred around addressing an economically unsustainable system of too many schools for the size of the population. And it's within this context then that the process of area planning was initiated and introduced. So area planning relative to schools is the responsibility of the Statutory Education Authority, and the aim of the area planning process is to establish a network of viable schools that are of the right type, the right size, and located in the right place, and have a focus on raising standards for all children. Against the backdrop of that, then, we were very aware of, as researchers, that educating pupils in different school sectors has implications for the fabric of society, not least when there is that limited interaction with and knowledge of the other. However, while this education system has been slow to change, there is growing evidence that parents and society in general are more in favour of an integrated approach and a single school system where pupils from all denominational backgrounds are educated together. To date, however, there has been a notable lack of any kind of formal mechanism that gives parents parity of voice on the issue of school places. And particularly when that dialogue has perhaps has been conducted largely by the statutory agencies. However, in 2020, one of the many times that the suspended Northern Ireland Assembly was reinstated, there was the New Decade, New Deal approach introduced by the Northern Ireland Executive, and it was introduced to restore the devolved governing institutions. And that document prioritised civic engagement, and public consultation should be at the heart of public policy making. And so our research focus on the community conversations, we would argue, is both timely and very relevant. Before I move on to the actual application of the community conversation, I did just want to give a little bit of sense of our understanding of the theoretical underpinnings that inform the academic side of our work. We're all very aware that the principle of engaging citizens in inclusive and meaningful dialogue is the cornerstone of deliberative democracy. And our understanding of deliberative democracy is its intention to work towards consensus through information, through dialogue and through debate. As an approach, we recognise that it can usefully inform and precede the formal consultation and decision-making processes, where developing shared intentions between conflicting communities or opposing voices is essential for effective and mutually beneficial outcomes. Deliberative democracy research that has been undertaken in divided societies has shown that it can promote recognition, mutual understanding, social learning about the other side, and even solidarity across deep differences. Efforts at deliberative democracy in Northern Ireland have had limited influence so far on policy, so a key challenge, therefore, for us, bridging that gap between community and between civic society and policy, is to provide communities with opportunities to contribute their views on key matters affecting their lives and to connect this with the wider policy sphere so that their input can have real and genuine impact on decision-making, policy development and policy implementation. Using this understanding then, deliberative democracy has alignment with Bronfenbrenner's human development research, which you are all familiar with. And his socio-ecological model shows the social environment as a concentric paradigm where the individual as at the centre is influenced by the expanding influences of interpersonal, organisational, community and societal norms. And these multiple influences underline the porous complexity of social systems, particularly in divided societies when multiple perspectives and ideological positions converge on a specific issue. In the context of this study, then, the socio-ecological model provides a very relevant conceptual framework for the participative democracy of community conversations, specifically its potential to harness the interplay between parents, social networks, their school, the community and public policy, and how collectively that can come to impact on sustainable school provision in Northern Ireland. So if I move on to briefly tell you a little bit about the community conversation methodology itself and the toolkit, the community conversation has a dual purpose. It's there to facilitate dialogue, giving individuals and communities a stronger voice in key decisions affecting them, and also to provide stakeholders involved in public policy and decision making with a genuine evidence base which they can use to inform their work. In other words, it creates a bridge between the individual, community and policy perspectives. The conversation methodology itself is underpinned by 4 key principles. Firstly, it's by the researchers who set the scope and the structure of the conversation through transparency of process, non-partisan leadership, acknowledgement of and respect for knowledge and perspectives, and assurances of confidentiality so that people feel they are in a safe place whenever they talk about issues that are socially and community sensitive. Secondly, it is very much encouraged that individuals listen and speak while respecting the other viewpoints through a process of active listening, frank and open dialogue, mutual recognition and respectful understanding of very differing viewpoints, which can sometimes run very, very contrary to what their own are. Thirdly, the participants themselves collectively shape the conversation and begin to identify possible solutions through shared discussion, reflection and negotiation. So it's about encouraging emergent rather than imposed ideas and actions, and the identification of shared solutions that align very much with that community's culture, its priorities and its resources. And then finally, the researchers bring that conversation to a close through encouragement towards a shared group understanding that is solution-focused, that's action-oriented, and that also has a realistic framing around the potential solutions relative to the context and resources of the community. But in order to create that effective process, we have become very mindful. It's crucial that none of those steps are overlooked. Nothing is missed in the sequencing of it, because otherwise the whole process can become undone. So I'll very quickly give you an overview of one particular case study of education provision in Northern Ireland. It draws on a recent conversation carried out in a rural area where there were a number of primary schools in close proximity but a surplus of school places. And the core question was, what is the best way forward for sustainable school provision in this area? And adhering to the socio-ecological model, parents were at the centre of the conversation, and they provided their own insights and their own interpersonal relationships and community networks in order to address the issues in terms of the governing systems around the Northern Ireland education system. So, for example, parents were very keen to emphasise the need to retain a school in a rural community that had already lost a lot of key services. One parent said, we need a school here. We've lost our bank, our post office, our doctor. If there's no school here, then families will move away, and what will we be then? However, parents also have a pragmatism as well in terms of what could represent sustainable school provision and that would be beneficial. With one parent saying, I feel that a more integrated approach would need to be taken. It would be more beneficial if these schools joined together. It would also be better for the community as a whole and Northern Ireland in general if children aren't segregated at a young age. So for us, the community conversation methodology is undoubtedly a step forward in a more democratic approach to policy making, and the evidence of shoots of change is indicative of its impact. So, for example, in relation to this particular case study, in September a couple of years ago, 2019, the principal and the parents outlined their plans to move forward to transform one of the schools into an integrated school. And parents' views on the impact of the community conversation in advancing their work in this area was, I think it gave us the confidence to move forward because there was this evidence base, and it generated an interest among parents. I think parents were suddenly very interested in the status quo of the sustainability of their school, and it has helped inform their community so they have a more confident voice of what they want for their kids. So, how much have I got? One, okay. Just to sum up, community conversations then for us are very much about change. It's about how people think about things, their behaviour, and ultimately about decision making, policy implementing and policy development in a way that connects individuals, communities, stakeholders and policy. However, we recognise it's not a panacea, and it will still be a challenge to see outcomes implemented at policy levels where the pace of reform can be seen both as a reaction to and a reflection of the fragility of a post-conflict society. And I will stop there because I don't want to run over my time. Sorry, it was a bit rushed at the end.
Great, thanks very much. Hi everybody, I'm Sian Bain, I'm from the University of Edinburgh, and thanks Gemma for inviting me to join this panel. So I am representing, I suppose, the Scottish contingent in this, and I'm talking about building a collective vision for the future of digital education specifically, although as I prefer to frame it, near future teaching. So I have a few different roles at the University of Edinburgh. I'm a professor of digital education. I also direct the Centre for Research in Digital Education. So I'm a researcher. I also direct the education portfolio of the new Edinburgh Futures Institute, so I'm very sort of directly a practitioner in that sense. And I have a university role as well as Assistant Principal for Education Futures, which includes elements of the digital. So I think Gemma's framing of this as kind of building the connections between research, policy and practice is quite helpful for me, because I was saying, I'm the connection between policy and practice, although for me it's institutional policy in my kind of university-wide role. So, yeah, my research centre does conduct sort of interdisciplinary research across technology, culture and learning, and its kind of intersection with digital education, research and practice specifically. So we do research with children and technology, with digital cultures, with data society, and also aspects of policy and strategy as well. We're based at the Murray House School of Education and Sport at Edinburgh. So it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sure everyone's shattered. I'm going to just throw lots of pictures at you. So what I want to start with really is this question of how is the future of digital education imagined, and how do we collectively, and there's a connection here with what we just heard from Una, how do we collectively build and develop an alternative vision, one which is based in the kind of values and priorities and perspectives of university staff and students. So I'm talking specifically within the context of higher education here. And if you've ever been unfortunate enough to do a Google image search on education futures, you'll find your screen filled with this kind of stuff. You know, we have in fact, it would be a lovely paper actually to do a sort of more in-depth kind of visual analysis of this imagery, but there's this tendency to see images which are very much focused on the technology, on students' kind of fascination with technology. They're almost sort of transfixed by technology. They're engaging with screens in a way that makes you not quite sure if they're mastering what's on the screen or if they're somehow hypnotized by it. You also see many images using a sort of cliched iconography from, you know, the idea of the university, you know, mortarboards, brains, kind of superimposed over data and light, as though somehow the engagement of education in the future with technology will sort of turn us all into transhumans. There's a kind of transhumanist kind of sort of merging with some of the technology in some of these images. So when I say all that, it's as a way really of framing what I see as some of the kind of broader imagined futures for education policy and practice as well, which I think are nicely exemplified in these kinds of images. And then when you start to drill down into not the academic literatures, but the kind of industry kind of publications and reports on the future of higher education, you get a lot of this kind of imaginary kind of reproduced in different ways, primarily and often through a kind of idea that teachers are no longer going to be required, or through an assumption that teaching will be deprofessionalized by AI, for example, as you see in this particular quote. And this was something which was amplified, of course, through the COVID-19 pandemic, this sense that, oh, maybe, you know, AI can come and do our teaching for us, so we don't need to invest in teachers. We're also seeing, you know, and this has been happening for a long time in higher education, this sense of, this idea of self-service learning that is going to increase, because now we all have access to technology, and DIY learning is the future, again, sort of erasing the role of the teacher there. And then if you drill down even further into kind of some of the projections and imaginaries that are constructed for the future of universities, you see it starts to get really quite dark again. We've got obviously the student transfixed by the light coming across the screen and the data going there. But also we've got some really profound kind of proposals here. Higher education is dead, long live the knowledge services sector. And then often these kind of future imaginaries are framed by an imperative. So, you know, in this case, the future is closer than you think. Change must start now or never. So the imperative to change is sort of imposed on universities without really engaging with the idea of what a university might be. And I think one of the quotes that alarms me and my colleagues most in this particular, it's an Ernst & Young report from last year, this, in the age of machine learning, we all need to become learning machines, again kind of looping us back to some of that almost transhumanist imagery in the first slide. So there's lots to be troubled about there, and I think that there's an imperative within universities and within the education sector generally, actually, to get better at telling our own stories and telling our own better stories about what we want from the future of higher education, particularly as it's articulated through digital technologies. So this is the focus of what I want to talk about very briefly this afternoon, is how a methodology that we developed at the University of Edinburgh in a project that I led between 2017 and 2019 called Near Future Teaching, which was about co-designing a values-based vision for digital education. It was a kind of community conversation, though not in the sense that Una has been telling us about. We used a kind of design-led approach where the first step is to define the question that you're asking. What's our preferred future for digital education at our university? We then entered a discovery phase where we looked at what values we wanted to shape this future and what the global trends were which were impacting on it. And during this discovery phase, we ran a lot of events with staff and students in the university. We did a lot of interviews. I think we engaged with about 400 people in total through events and kind of vox pop interviews and panels and so on. So we gathered a lot of data from the community, which was students, postgraduate and undergraduate staff, professional services staff and academic staff. And we also did some desk research looking at these kind of global trends which are most likely to impact on our futures. So at that point, towards the end of the first year of the project, we were able to define a set of values and a preferred future. We then developed aims and objectives for this future and looked at what actions we would need to take to get us there. So that was the kind of very broad kind of trajectory of this piece of work, which took place over a 2-year period. I should say that towards the end of the project, we also worked with school kids as well to understand their values for the future of higher education and with employers too. So we took all this data from staff and students, and we worked with a design company who helped us create a lot of really good visuals around what people were telling us. And one of the things that we created was a set of opinion cards where we did a sort of an affinity mapping of what people were saying, and then transposed those onto a set of cards that we could use in various workshops and so on. Some of these opinions were we framed as outlying opinions, like too much technology can threaten well-being. I'm not sure it would be that much of an outlying opinion actually now, post-COVID. Others were kind of core to the values that people were telling us they wanted the university to adopt around diversity as an enhancement of education and so on. So there were a lot of different kind of perspectives that students and staff were raising that we captured in this way. One of the dominant ones was that education should not be treated like a commodity. We also did a lot of interviews with students, so we did, I think, about 40 or 50 interviews, and then we edited them down into kind of 3-minute videos based around particular themes. And we did, in this project, put a lot of resource into sort of media production and graphic design, because I think it was important to us that people engaged with this research, and if you want people to engage with it, you need them to want to spend time with it. So we made it as visually and graphically as accessible as we could. We defined a set of values which emerged from the work with students and staff. So these were the values that the community within the university wanted to underpin our work in digital education specifically. And they were focused on valuing holistic student experience over performativity and assessment, embedding diversity and justice into everything we do, using technology to build relationships and putting relationships first, and then taking a kind of broad approach to participation and flexibility, including interdisciplinarity and flexible pathways through study. At that point, rather than go on and write a set of objectives based on the values, we wanted to do another stage of the research where we looked at potential future worlds that higher education or education generally would need to inhabit, and that we would need to apply these values within. So as a research team, we've done a lot of kind of research in the area of education futures. We developed kind of 4 scenarios for the future of higher education, which you can see here. I don't have time to go into them in a lot of detail, but they were focused on, what would it look like if we tried to apply the values of diversity and justice into this data everywhere scenario where everything is tightly pinned down and locked down by datafication and marketization. What would it look like if we wanted to emphasize the whole human experience in the context of a highly unbundled sector in the sort of Uberification model? So we developed these kind of scenarios. They're all available in the final report from the project if you'd like to dig into them a bit more. I'm happy to say more later. And then we ran workshops using those scenarios and using the values and talking in some depth about how we would apply the values into each of these kind of worlds, some of which were a bit utopic, most of them were quite dystopic, but we tried not to fall into that trap of doing the kind of utopia-dystopia thing. And as a result of that work, we were able to state a set of aims which would drive our digital education policy within the institution. This was that digital education should be playful and experimental, allow students to take risks. It should be community-focused, helping build the community, not driving it apart. It should be oriented to assessment, helping not only to sort of ease the burden of assessment, but also to make assessment more fun and more relevant and more manageable by students. It should be post-digital in the sense that it needs to recognise that digital isn't a thing which is separate from everyday life anymore. It's embedded in everything that we do. It needed to be boundary challenging. We needed to work really hard as an institution to understand how digital education and technology can help us transcend disciplinary boundaries, for examples. And then data fluency was the final one, which was about we are in a data society. We are all experiencing the sort of effects of datafication. How do we empower and enable students to be able to work critically with that and confidently with it? So that's the kind of outcomes from the project. Since the project ended in 2019, we obviously then went into COVID, and it was very helpful to us to have this underpinning, this values underpinning, as we managed the whole COVID pivot and the sort of nightmare that was that year or two. And now as we emerge out of COVID, those institutional conversations are still going on. They're informing the dialogue within the university at kind of senior management level and at the level of academics and students. And next, we want to continue to develop these kind of future imaginaries. So we're going into a new phase of the project now where we're developing, we're further developing a more fleshed out set of future scenarios, drawing on what we've learned from the Near Future Teaching Project, looking at kind of what the future university might look like in terms of universality, unbundling, justice, importantly, what universities need to do to pivot themselves to address climate change and climate breakdown and other kind of trends that we know are shaping the future of what we do. And then we're also developing kind of new ways of kind of sharing these. So we're taking a kind of creative writing approach to some of these, and as well as developing work through scenarios, we're also developing 8 short stories that will go with those scenarios, which will be coming out hopefully in next month. So I'll stop there. I've given a link to the report there if you'd like to dig further, and thank you very much for listening.
It does feel very strangely formal coming up here and adopting the mantle of the speaker in this room. But there we go. I was expecting more of a fireside chat. Sean drew attention just now to some imagined futures in the realm of digital HE and futures of HE. We want to say a bit about another kind of imagined future, or at least attempts to realise some sort of better arrangement in the world of research evidence and its use in policy and practice. It's that sort of connection I can see between those two things. And I thought it was worth just going back to where the term sort of emerged, really. Comes from ecology. An American, well-known American ecologist, Arthur Tansley, introduced the concept in 1935 of ecosystem, wanting to promote a systems understanding. And the kind of point of that was to encourage colleagues, the field, to get further away from trying to understand the world, the natural world, by looking at individual organisms and looking as well at their relation, or as much, perhaps more, at their relationships and their interdependencies and their influences. So it's a very, I mean, that's a very widespread theoretical shift, isn't it? You find it in Kurt Lewin talking about field, or for that matter, Bourdieu to some extent, I suppose. However, ecosystem has been used even in that world, in the ecology world, in at least 3 different ways, and worth just nodding to those to see what they're like. First of all, there can be a biological focus on the organism, but appreciating its context. Secondly, you can start with a set of processes or flows of matter. You know, it's a bit like studying a light bulb, or studying a light bulb was an instance of the conversion of one sort of energy into another. You know, you can start in both of those places. And thirdly, geographic places, an ecosystem seen as a geographical location of, or locations that have something in common or similarities. And in fact, Tansley points out that last one, it's become very useful writing about this, another ecologist, Blue, does describe how that's based on a misunderstanding and a conflation of the words special and spatial, but I won't go into that because that's a bit too nerdy, I think. We'll stop there and move on to the application of the notion of ecosystem, which, you know, seems to be quite a sexy term. Lots of people want to use it, and perhaps some more successfully than others. It appears, of course, a great deal in the United Nations Environment Programme, where it becomes a way of looking at the world, a way of interacting actually with economics and the sort of economics that one might need in talking to policy. So, for example, you might express the value of an avenue of trees in terms of what it would save people in terms of expenditure, or what it might benefit individuals in terms of well-being. And talk about that in monetary terms. That gets done quite a lot. It's a very complex concept when it's in the hands of the Environment Programme, I have to say. But more to get us a little closer to where we need to end up, Shepherd, famously, who is closely linked with the What Works initiative, has talked a lot about an evidence ecosystem, and about evidence pipelines and leaks in pipelines. And here, ecosystem is a bit different. I mean, it's still a system, and it's still full of mutual dependencies, but it's seen really as a kind of model for the ideal of efficiency, where the needs of an evidence, for evidence, which is a demand, can be better articulated and fully responded to, or more immediately and efficiently responded to in terms of supply. So Shepherd talks about What Works centres being an essential part of the ecosystem, the evidence ecosystem, particularly in worlds like education, and talks about that leading to more efficient uses of information, research evidence, and indeed behaviour change. The term was used again extensively in this report, which came out 3 or 4 years ago from the Royal Society and the British Academy, called Harnessing Education Research. And in there, ecosystem is the sort of headline concept, and there's lots of appreciation of the subtleties, interdependencies, and multiple causal effects of things on one another, sure. Although, I have to say, that sort of diminishes in importance when you start to read the recommendations, the principal one of which is draws on some stakeholder interviews. And as it says in the middle of this slide, its main diagnosis is that researchers, practitioners, and policymakers do not have shared priorities. The solution to that, proposed in the document, is a new Office for Education Research, a coordinating body, to make a more efficient, a bit like the OSCHR in health, a more efficient connection between the research that gets asked for, funded and done, and the needs that are identified, presumably in the main by policymakers, but perhaps sometimes publics. So that idea is, the ecosystem idea is the sort of wrapping around what seems to me to be an argument about supply and demand and coordination. I think it's interesting to play with the idea of ecosystem. You know, there's a great deal here on offer. And so I'm sort of playing around with that harnessing word and talking about democratic harnessing and thinking a little bit about what we were hearing just earlier. And the concept of ecosystem, you know, was, as I said earlier, promoted to encourage looking beyond the organism. And to jump to the second paragraph here, of course, the needs of policymakers and professionals should always be a prime consideration in what educational research is done. However, a democratic ecosystem in education might also listen to those whose expertise has been built from sustained and critical engagement with the thing of concern, and perhaps with publics as well. So my last slide, and Sally will take over in a second. Is Wales a favourable setting for an ecosystem, a more vibrant, more perhaps connected world of education research and practice and policy. Just to briefly draw attention here, Wales has a specific historical policy in which education policy is played out. I could say more about that. The second point here, there is a Welsh way of doing politics. Many people have observed this. It's partly the Labour tradition in conjunction with the Plaid Cymru community orientation. It's the first country in the UK where the government has sought to make a socio-ecological model central to its policy, particularly economic policy. The fourth point here, there's actually an act passed by the government in Wales called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which requires consideration of all sorts of ramifications for every piece of legislation and certain things of the behaviour of all those involved. And finally, there's an extensive education reform programme which includes a reconceptualised school curriculum. And these reforms put research and higher education and school partnerships, incidentally, at the heart of teacher education. But it's early days. Sally. Feel the weight of office as you walk up the stairs.
I'm listening to the thunder as well. It's very dramatic. Okay. I'm just going to, the last 5 slides, I'm going to draw on, I suppose, my own experience of trying to working within the ecosystem in Wales and some of the challenges. There have been a real number of, in some ways it is a propitious context for the development of this ecosystem. The Welsh Government's insistence on partnership working and on evidence base means that they've put in lots of initiatives at different phases. So at the level of the school, for instance, schools are interested to be self-improving. Estyn is not in any way the same as Ofsted in the way it approaches schools. Teachers are entrusted very extraordinarily in some ways. They have been entirely responsible for developing the new curriculum in Wales, which is based on their own experience of what matters for children and young people in terms of their knowledge requirements. In terms of the development of the teaching profession, the new ITE criteria means that schools are required to support students in engaging in action research, and that all HE staff, so there's a typo there, engaged in ITE must be research active. These are kind of the visions in some way. Those of you who went to David's talk about the REF would realise actually only 3 HEIs in Wales submitted to the REF, and 4 HEIs that do deliver initial teacher education did not submit to the REF. So these are perhaps aspirations rather than reality. The Welsh Government as well has invested with the UKRI in trying to support the education research community through the doctoral training partnership. Though again, the extent to which that is specifically for Wales rather than the UKRI is questionable. For the last 10 years, I've been involved in Wizard Education, which was funded by the Higher Education Funding Council for Wales to support the development of research across HEIs in Wales with limited success. And in the last 2 years, the Welsh Government has set up a national strategy for educational research and inquiry, which is designed to foster research at all levels and phases of the education system, and has put in place various networks of expertise and partnership, unfunded kind of small grants to support education researchers. So all this is kind of quite promising. But despite all this, there's little growth of education research in Wales. You can see this has been quite a long decline from 1996. And obviously, I know research evaluation exercises have got slightly changed. But in 1996, there were over 100 staff deemed research active in education in Wales. And by 2014, that was only 20. So it was a 5-fold decline. Now, you might argue, if you look at the last REF, that 62 staff were returned to the education sub-panel, which you might, from 3 institutions, which you might argue that is an increase. But if you actually, that figure is quite problematic. Firstly, we know that universities were required to return all staff rather than being selective. And secondly, we know if you looked at the fine detail of that 62, that quite a lot of those are not actually straightforwardly involved in education research. When you look at why perhaps it's not working, it's very easy to look at problems within the ecosystem, and Wales faces a number of challenges. Firstly, Wales is the poorest part of the UK by far. It really suffers disproportionately under the Barnett formula that determines public expenditure that gets released from Westminster. It suffers from geography. Wales is a small country, and it makes it really difficult to achieve economies of scale. Bilingualism creates additional resource demands, and Wales is a bilingual country. A quarter of its schools are Welsh medium. It's not just in terms of curriculum materials that it creates financial demands. Actually, to do educational research in a bilingual context is quite resource intensive. It's geographically divided. It's quite hard takes you a long time to get from Cardiff to Bangor. And because it's a small country, relations between policymakers, researchers, and education stakeholders, they're what's often called particularistic rather than universalistic. I know often people think it's great in Wales because you can talk to your special advisors in policy and people know each other. There are problems with that. And particularly the impact of a few individuals, for good or bad, is far greater in a small country than it is in a larger country. And opportunities for occupational mobility are more limited. So there are constraints within any ecosystem about how you can foster this vibrant research community. There's also external forces. Wales really suffers, like all poorer countries do, from a brain drain and the problem of outward migration. The number of PhD students that stay in Wales is quite limited. We suffer constantly, not surprisingly, given we're a Labour-controlled government, from a Conservative-dominated Westminster, from an English-dominated media, from a lot of hostility in the press. Here's a few examples from the media and from politicians. School standards causing concern. Labour future, it doesn't work, it's called Wales. Or Michael Gove, you only need to look over the Severn to see a country going backwards. And that's quite damaging because the media is so England-dominated. A lot of people in Wales, they read that, and I think there's not very strong counter-narrative. So I think it's quite depressing. But perhaps the most depressing figures are actually the financial level, the money that's going into research in Wales. So these are the figures from the latest UKRI funding report. If we look at from 2018 to 19, per capita spend in Wales of UKRI funding, that covers everything from health to medicine, is £9 compared to 52 in London, 45 in Scotland. Even the poorest country in England gets over twice what Wales does. And if we look at ESRC funding, which covers education, as well as other things, it's £2 million in Wales in terms of value of grants, compared to 45 million in London, 39 million in northwest of England in here, and 17 million for Scotland. They're quite staggering inequalities in terms of research investment. So, concluding remarks. I think David and I, but it's easy to rubbish the concept of an ecosystem. We actually think the concept of an ecosystem is quite useful because it draws attention to the interconnectedness of context and components. But it's very problematic when it's used in a reductive manner, and it underestimates the significance of the material basis you need to grow sustaining and fruitful connections, which is a real problem for Wales. And finally, there's a tendency when you talk about a system to focus on internal weaknesses of this system in isolation from the wider context in which it operates. So I'm going to stop there.
Hello. I'm Ken Jones. I'm Head of Education Policy at the National Education Union. I'll say more about the National Education Union in a minute. I'm also emeritus at Goldsmiths, and I'm Welsh. I'm a child of the Swansea Valley, but I find myself speaking for England in this session in ways which I hope provide a kind of fruitful contrast with what Sally and David were talking about. I want to say something about educational research, something about teacher trade unionism, and seek to relate the two. We know from the presidential address yesterday, we had it as a good reminder, that after Hargreaves' famous intervention in the 1990s, it became a kind of axiom of policymakers that educational practice should be based on research evidence and that research should be subjected to centralized agenda setting. And I think that's those two truths, as it were, have exercised a dominant influence on the research field and the field of practice, to the point where, in relation to school education, the field of educational research, where it especially concerns issues of educational practice, is dominated by organizations and networks established, funded, or otherwise supported by governments. On top of that, which is a kind of pre-existing situation created, I think, in the 1990s, we have a new kind of ratcheting up of the problems. I think from 2010, conservative or conservative-led governments have made a distinction between friends and enemies in education in England and applied this to questions of theory, research method, knowledge, and pedagogy. And I think we should note the kind of peculiarity of this perspective on the part of governments, that it's not just setting general directions for educational research and educational practice, it is applying itself to the determination of what that practice should look like, what its research reference points should be. And one of the extraordinary documents, most extraordinary things I've read in the last couple of years, is an interview with the former schools minister, Nick Gibb, by Tom Bennett of Research Ed. It's a very soft interview. It's essentially, Bennett is asking Gibb, where do your ideas come from? And Gibb tells him at some length, in which Gibb declares his utter rejection of what he describes as Dewey, teacher's college record, and Rousseauist pedagogy. And the schools minister has spoken, and that has had an influence, as I'll try to show in a minute. Some examples of this kind of research policy network under the conditions of constraint, which I've been trying to describe. They're all, I think, from the present, really. There's the announcement last week that the DFE is going to fund the Education Endowment Foundation with a grant of 137 million to support the government's teacher training reforms, and a further 41.5 million to increase access to high-quality literacy and numeracy programs. Up to 21 million will support maths and English hubs. This is one organisation occasionally described as a charity, sometimes described as an independent charity, benefiting from quite enormous sums of money to evaluate educational practice and to shape a particular educational agenda as it applies to the working of schools. Alongside that, we have another major initiative. Ofsted is indeed very different from Estin. Ofsted, since 2021, has been producing curriculum research reviews, and these reviews are increasingly used as the touchstone of good practice in relation to subject teaching in secondary schools, and they also have an influence in the primary sector as well. They should be controversial. They're certainly contested, but it's not as if the whole educational ecosystem is awash with debate and criticism about Ofsted's perspective on on educational research in relation to the curriculum. The English Association has, among other organisations, made some statements in relation to the English Review, suggesting that Ofsted's evidence base is sparse, methodologically insecure, relying on opinion rather than robust research. And it seems to me like a simulation of research rather than the thing itself. But that's kind of less important. Well, it's important, but alongside that, you have to note the sheer power and influence of this codification of educational research, of centralized kind of agenda setting, which works its way through into schools. And then today, no less, we had the announcement of the formal launch of the Oak National Academy, which is designed to, which has just been awarded, I think, £43 million this morning of DFE funding in order to provide curriculum resources for schools. It's growing out of and spilling over from work done during the pandemic. It's establishing, the Oak National Academy is establishing itself as a permanent body, supposedly at arm's length from governments, which will produce resources, lesson plans, and more extensive kinds of curriculum design intended to cover periods of whole years and key stages. It will use Ofsted's curriculum reviews to ensure its work is informed by the best available evidence and aligns with best practice. So you've got this kind of very tight relationship between one organisation and another, kind of recirculating particular conceptions of educational research, both as method and as a substantive set of propositions. And that seems to me important. It's distinctive to England, and it's a problem for, I think, teachers and teacher trade unions. Educational workers, I think, are used to being treated as a policy problem by governments since the 1970s, deprived of influence, I once wrote, at every level, from national politics to the staff meeting and the classroom. The National Education Union experiences that. We're very large. We're, I think, the biggest union in Europe. 420,000 is the figure we submitted to the government's kind of registrar of trade unions. It's the official figure of our membership. We're large, but we lack negotiating rights on pay and conditions. We're affected by legal constraints on industrial action. We face the consequences for union organisation of the fragmentation of the English system into one dominated by academies and multi-academy trusts. That's a problem for union organisation where you have that many bargaining units. We're capable of significant levels of mobilisation. During the pandemic, I think we had 400,000 people on one of our Zoom calls, 400,000, discussing what was really a life or death question, which is should teachers return to work and support staff in January 2021. And the kind of pressure resulting from teachers meant that most schools stayed largely closed at that time. But that level of impact is episodic, not continuous. We're involved in knowledge production of many kinds. Perhaps I could just mention the School Cuts campaign in the 2017 general election. We produced a website which allowed anyone interested to click onto any school in England and to identify its budget and how much that budget had been cut since 2010. It was a very, very influential tool. It's apparently made a difference to voting patterns in parts of the country where educational spending had been particularly badly affected. So we do some research that's kind of self-generated. We also face the question of qualitative research. We want to support our members in a fragmented system where networks or organisations autonomous of government have been thinned out and where research findings of the sort I've described are deployed in a context of hyper-managerialism. So we want to enable our members to be able to speak back to some of the policies and policy effects I spoke of earlier. We want to change the terms of public argument as well, challenging justifications for current policies. we face ourselves problems in this. One is the fact that in research terms, we're not that influential. There's a constant production of new plans to relate education policy to economic need that come from the centre ground of politics, whose arguments are to do with modernisation, to do with economic needs, to do with the development of individuals of a kind which can match with imagined economic needs. This is different, I think, from, as it were, the spontaneous ideology, you might want to call it, of teachers, whose interest is in the social character of education, in questions of place and belonging, of questions of equalities, in questions of recovery from COVID. The nature of teachers' work leads away from the main themes that are established by centre-ground think tanks in England. And we try to do something to capture that set of interests of teachers. We also attempt to provide research-based practical support for teachers rather than simply critiques of policy that exists. One of our relatively successful initiatives has been the production of an anti-racist framework, working with academic colleagues to produce something that's that we can take into a school context, which is kind of auditable and which makes immediate sense in terms of the working of the school. What I've described then is a situation where policy, does that say finish? Right. Where policy is contested, adversarial, antagonistic, where the effects on schools and on the educational space more generally are constraining, and where an effort is being made on our parts and on the part of other organisations to open up spaces for argument and criticism, to speak back to policy, and also suggest areas of work, areas of curriculum and pedagogic work, where teachers can achieve some kind of lever for change and aren't simply as it were, experiencing the weight of the agendas I've tried to evoke and describe. And that's where I'll stop.
All this would work if there were two of us, and there aren't. There are five. Okay, never mind. I said at the beginning of the presentation that we would have a variety of people contributing. We've heard very different kind of pictures from the four nations. The first two were very much about exploiting opportunities to work in partnership with others. And then we've got two rather different perspectives from very contrasting situations in which policy is taking a very different attitude towards engaging research and changing practice. What I wondered if in listening to this variety of presentations, it would raise questions for those of us in the hall about what is the role of the researcher under these circumstances. Where should we be putting our energies? Should we be going small? Should we be trying to go big? I'm just inviting anybody sitting in the body of the hall who would have a question along those lines or wants to ask for some further information from any of the speakers, please to do so. We do have a roving mic at the back, carried by a red T-shirt. One question. That's true. Yeah, no, yeah. We could just stand, actually. We'll pass the mic up and down the row. Well, we're all waiting to be interrogated, so. Sean, first, and then behind you.
Is this working?
Not entirely convinced.
Okay, shall I talk a bit louder? Okay, as Una can probably tell, I'm from Northern Ireland, and I have a rather specific and slightly hypothetical question for Una, but thank you very much for the presentation. I mean, community conversations, I mean, basically those were what eventually led to the peace process. Both sides finally started talking to each other, which was great. And the example of using them to resolve issues around school place planning, something I'm actually involved in London, and there's lessons there for me about how we might deal with rapidly reducing and plummeting numbers in some of London's local authorities. But my question to you, and is much more hypothetical, if the policymakers in Northern Ireland were brave enough to say we're going to have a fully integrated system in 10 years' time, and we're going to work to achieve that, and by integrated I mean schools where Catholic and Protestant kids go to school together, how many generations would it take for sectarianism to disappear?
I'm not sure I'm able to answer that question, Sean. I can only, I suppose, answer it within the context of the research that we have been doing. And as you know yourself, and part of the rationale for the community conversation is about bringing people along with you as part of the process. It's certainly not about enforcing or, adding that top-down emphasis on it.
That's why I give you 10 years.
Yeah. Well, there is always that debate of whether it would take 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. The only touchstone, I suppose, that we're able to use at the moment are things, for example, like survey data, such as there's an annual Life and Times survey, which is run in Northern Ireland every year. There's also a Young Life and Times and a Kids Life and Times, and all of those collect data on different demographic issues, including preferences around schooling. And over successive years, the rate of preference perhaps towards a more common form of school provision has grown and grown, and not just from parents but from young people themselves. So there is an awareness of beginning to gather alternative forms of data that will support the argument of the move towards a more unified system of schools. And I know some of the statutory authorities and organisations such as the Integrated Education Fund are looking at how they can improve their data collection to support the evidence base in moving forward with just a more sustainable form of schooling. So I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's, as you know yourself, and as I said, the pace has been incredibly slow. But there seems to be a willingness there, and Northern Ireland society has changed and evolved. The demographics of it have changed and evolved in recent years. Also, that we just keep looking forward, I guess, and hoping that this provides sufficient momentum, that 95% does begin to drop. But I've no magic mirror, no magic wand that I can predict how long that will take, Sean.
I thought it was lower than 95. I thought the integrated school population...
It's about 93, 94, maybe it's sort of it's a rule of thumb.
And the colleagues may or may not, if you don't know the Northern Ireland geographies, of course, that also complicates it. Even 10 years might be enough to achieve it because of where people actually live.
Exactly. And the rural settings are particularly problematic because we do have a culture of an awful lot of rural primary schools scattered over very, very wide geographic areas as well, which compounds the problem.
But also talking about it is a good way forward.
Second speaker, let's pass the microphone on.
Hi, diolch, thank you for everyone presenting today. Sure, a lot of wealth and expertise on the panel. So I live and work in Wales. All my education has been in Wales, and more importantly, my children are currently being educated in Wales. And I suppose I feel a little bit disheartened hearing some of the findings that were highlighted here today. I'm aware, being in education, about the many challenges that we face. And I guess for me, as an early careers researcher, I'm just entering the second year of my PhD now, with my focus on widening participation to non-traditional learners in the higher education sector. Any suggestions on what we can do to make this look different, I guess, within Welsh communities?
What is the challenge that troubles you most?
I suppose just knowing the lack of, absolutely in terms of policy, research seems to be very high in terms of the Welsh agenda, in terms of research and influencing policy, but it looks like that's not actually happening in practice. HEI establishments, teaching practitioners, I'm very keen to try and raise the profile of research within any avenues I can. I mean, just being here at the conference, there's clearly a lack of Welsh representation. So it's, what do we do differently to try and reduce that gap?
Well, you get your PhD and you stay in Wales.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. That is really the first thing. And then you bring others on. I mean, it's going to take a long time. And I do think the government is really trying to sponsor it. We need more money from the UKRI, and that's a problem because it's a competitive, and when you start from a low base, you don't want a special treatment, but then it's really difficult. So
Yeah, I think one of the things that came out of Ken's presentation of the figures of just the amount of money that is now going through EEF or to Oak Academy compared to the amounts of money that are available for research tells its own story, actually. And certainly there is huge, you know, although it may look like Wales is getting a particularly poor deal, which it may be, I don't know what the figures are for Northern Ireland, but actually none of this is very generous, actually. And if somebody is really wanting to produce an ecosystem that functions well and not as an efficient pipeline from here to there, it's not how you would do it. Go on, David.
I think that's absolutely right. Looking at those figures on Ken's slide, compared to the figures I was showing yesterday morning, for example, for the whole of the UK, the annual external funding for research that's recorded pretty faithfully by universities, it's in their interest to maximise what they say with evidence, is £55 million a year. And that's for everything. And it's gone down since the last ref. And as I said yesterday, as a proportion relative to public expenditure on education of all kinds, it's minuscule. It's 1/20th of 1%.
Anybody else on the panel want to come in on this? Ken, do you want to add?
No, I don't think so, no.
Okay. Any other questions out there?
I want good presentations, and I was thinking about one of the constraints you said about Wales is hostile media, and how do you plan to tackle this? And I'm saying this as my research is on Africa, and I try to challenge the representation of Africa, and I think that's a major challenge because the media seem to set the narrative or the discourse which continue to create a narrative that continue to exacerbate the inequalities in our society.
I think it's really true. Wales's only paper that was produced in the country closed last week, The National, which was a digital paper which you could subscribe to online, and that closed last week. There is no national... I don't think there's any papers that are not supported, basically run by England media companies anymore. So it's really hard. And people in Wales... I've been asked to go and present to, I think, the U3A in Porthcawl about all the school academies in Wales. I'm saying, we don't have academies in Wales, but people don't know that, because they don't know, they don't understand their own country. So some of it is just a silence, let alone hostility. But when you get silence and hostility, it's very hard to counteract. And the people have tried, but because it's a small country and because media is struggling anyway, it's difficult.
Thank you.
It's all a bit depressing.
From London, Wales stands out as an example of a country where government has put its weight behind some of the arguments of Black Lives Matter. To have a government encouraging the development of a curriculum that's attentive to Black histories and to the kind of entanglement, the deep entanglement of Wales in slavery, that's something worth noting. In England, I know that this is a governmental initiative, and I know that the situation in schools is often very different from what you get in, through government committees, but nevertheless. In England, I think one of the encouraging things that happened during the pandemic was just the proliferation of initiatives and conversations around questions of inequality relating to racialization. I think this is a kind of under the radar set of developments, but it seems to me the most consistent, most consistent force that's raising other educational questions outside of the agenda which government is so keen to promote. And every so often you get a real kind of welling up of issues around inequality. In Hackney earlier this year, for instance, in London, to do with the searching of one young woman at a school in Hackney. So there is that which should never be forgotten as a dimension of educational practice. And in speaking about the kind of squeeze that the policy research nexus influences schools in England, puts upon schools in England, I probably didn't say enough about these kind of pushings back that are significant, I think.
And I just do want to add to that on the pushing back agenda. I mean, I and a team of researchers at UCL ran 4 projects on COVID between May 2020 and September 2021. That's 4 projects, 2 with ESRC funding. They were very rapid, they were very fast, they used tools that could get data out quickly, and what we did was engage in the public conversation, because the public conversation was drawing attention not to the attainment gaps growing, but to the effects of poverty on families and children. The public conversation was saying, why isn't there proper funding? Think Marcus Rashford in England campaigning on free school meals for children living in poverty. Somehow, the catch-up narrative has created, I think, a diversion within schools, because it's made central to schools, or attempted to make central to schools, that it's the attainment gap that matters. Actually, it's the material gap that matters, in actual material poverty and what it does. And for a very long while, that's been politically unspeakable. It does strike me that both through COVID and now through a cost of living crisis, material poverty and its effects on children has become speakable again. And certainly for me as a researcher, I think it's part of my responsibility to speak it and bring it into the public domain. Our best go at getting a newspaper headline, oddly enough, was when one of our final reports, we got a kind of the welfare state isn't working spread I think it was the Daily Mirror. And we knew we had to spin it as a disaster story. And if we spun it as a disaster story, it would get traction in the media. So that, but again, it's kind of, as researchers, being able to think engagedly about a political and policy environment that we don't control, I think, but not give up.
Yeah, what you've just said, I think, maybe relates to what I was saying about telling better stories, and developing methodologies that help you tell strong stories and push them out. I mean, as someone who lives in Scotland, we're also no stranger to being patronised by English media and politicians. And I think part of it is about seizing control of the narrative. And in the end, we're not just constrained by mainstream news media. We have social media, and we have many other ways of telling our story and pushing it out there.
And I think actually your slides, Sian, show that. You know, they're a very serious commitment to telling a different story. And I love that contrast between the first set of slides you'd got on the mortarboards and the, people hypnotized by media, and then what you yourselves were producing later on. I think it's been a really significant attempt to make people think differently. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else want to raise a question? You've got about 5 more minutes. One over at the back. We're just baton transferring, I think.
Thank you. I'm from Northern Ireland as well, but based in Aberdeen in Scotland. But my question, because I feel it is, apologies, I don't mean this in a negative way, but it's sort of doom and gloom. So I just wondered whether, one or more of you, like, what gives you the most hope in relation to your own talk?
That's a lovely question. We're going to do it down the row.
Do you want to start?
Well, I think what gives me most hope is that despite the dominance of the English media, we continue to vote for an old-fashioned social democratic government in Wales, which is quite an amazing feat, I think. And trade unionism is still stronger in Wales than ever. So the legacies are, it's still vibrant, and I think it's very different. It feels very different from England, even despite the problems.
I think what gives me hope is observing populist individualism eat itself. It's taking a long time, but it seems to be eating itself. And the pandemic, ironically, was part of that. If you believe in that people's life chances are governed by their intelligence and their efforts, and that's the end of the story, then you don't have much time for public health measures, and you don't have much time for persuading people to care for each other. And yet, you know, we saw that happening in all sorts of governments. And I think that sped things up. I do think that there's been a bit more of a general realization of that going on. And that does give me hope, because it opens up spaces for more democratic engagements right down to the community level, actually. Ken, do you want to go next?
I found it a difficult question to answer because I'm just struck by the depth of the social, economic, environmental crisis. I think over the last couple of years, what's been significant and might be a basis for kind of constructive hope is what happens if the squeeze is released just a bit, as I think it was in the pandemic when governments in England, the government's power to influence the detailed workings of schools was kind of perforce relaxed in the conditions of the pandemic and the kind of localism of situations which teachers were in a position to respond to and central government plainly wasn't. I think you could say the same thing around Black Lives Matter, where something was forced open for a period, and there really is a kind of ferment of ideas and practice around that. So I'm looking for points of that sort, rather than for some kind of any immediate systemic transformation.
And what's occurring to me is a conversation I had yesterday with the head of a MAT, who has got his governing body on board to take poverty in his community very seriously and to know that the social side of education really matters. He's incredibly worried about what will happen with the funding around school heating and knows that there will be a financial crisis in the school, but he's got the backing of the governing board to try and do their own thinking out of it, and we're speaking about doing that on the back of having discovered that freedom during COVID. And if there are general problems, the inability of policy right now to solve those problems actually does bring it back to all of us, I think. And, you know, I listened to Una talk about these structured conversations she's having in very difficult situations. That gives me hope, actually.
I suppose this is going to sound cheesy, probably. I suppose students give me hope. I mean, I think what gives me hope also is the power of good education persists. And when you see what students are doing, the energy and vision and, I don't know, rigour which they're bringing to the project of doing things differently, you know, that gives me massive hope. Yeah, that and Scottish independence, maybe.
Yes, and I do appreciate it. Maybe did sound doom and gloom from where you all were sitting, but it might seem as if, oh my goodness, there's been no change in Northern Ireland, but I can promise you that there has been, although the figures wouldn't suggest otherwise. And I think by giving parents a voice and allowing them to feel that they genuinely have ownership of some of the decisions affecting their children has been an important shift. The fact that this work has been endorsed by the statutory, by the Education Authority and the Department of Education gives me hope that it really will follow through into transformative change where there is parental willingness to do that. And even our elections last year, although we don't have a functioning government at the moment, the fact that the election results showed a massive sweep towards the middle ground, as opposed to the binary associations that we would normally associate with Northern Ireland, that for me is a massive sea change also. And I think it's just people just getting fed up with the status quo and wanting to begin that process of change. So that gives me hope that we are moving in the right direction.
Okay, I think we are out of time. I just want to thank you all coming along at the end of a long second day when there's lots of other things going on, and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you very much.